Good morning, namaskara, salam to everyone. I'm Aprajita, and my friends here and outside call me mother of Haiyya and Tathya. Tathya is my 18 months old son who's currently organizing his grandparents at the hotel for his unreasonable demands. But truly, it's such an incredible honor to be here and extending such a warm welcome to all of you at the first ever Bangalore edition of the Community Organizing Festival organized by Haiyya and the Leading Change Network. This festival is labor of love, of Haiyya's labor of love that has given us the opportunity to bring all of you who have been our partners, supporters, allies, learners together. My beautiful team members from Haiyya and LCN together. Marshall students and teaching fellows here, and some of you who we haven't worked with before, all under one roof. So thank you for being curious, open, and joining us here. And a very special welcome to Professor Marshall Ganz, who has traveled for more than 7,000 miles, 30 hours, and more, because he has been traveling from Delhi, Varanasi to now to Bangalore. He has read and conversed with so many of us and his Indian students to begin what he calls an appetizer of an ongoing, lifelong learning journey about Haiyya, about India. I grew up in Raigad, Chhattisgarh, and my parents were public sector banking and insurance workers who had fallen in love and decided to go against their parents' wishes to get married to each other. There was a lot of evening chais, Sundays, festival time, cooking, playtime in my childhood with me and my younger brother. When I was 8 years old, in 1994, my family went through a tragedy where my father was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and the legal battle started. My friends and batchmates stopped talking to me because they were told by their family not to, because of the legal battles. It was hard because it suddenly felt so lonely. I was judged, and I was so lost in school. The hardest part was eating tiffin during recess break alone. I was 9-year-old in my 4th grade and sitting at the stairs on the ground floor all by myself and eating my box. My brother also used to study in the same school, but we had different buildings about like 200 meters away. One day we came back from school and we changed our clothes. I saw his tiffin box and it was as it is. He had not eaten anything. So I asked him, why? And he told, Appi, mujhe school nahi jana. Appi is my nickname. Appi, I don't want to go to school. I asked him why, and he told me no one speaks with him. We couldn't stop our tears. We wept and we hugged tight. Next day, when the recess bell rang, we both ran from our buildings towards each other because we had decided we would meet halfway at a place which was under a tree shed, and we will eat our tiffin together there. That day was after months that we had finally eaten at peace. We ate well, we laughed, we cribbed about the same aloo puri in our tiffin. We bitched about our teachers, and we went back to our classes. And we continued that till our classmates, were less volatile towards us. That day and doing this, I learned about care, love, relationship, and commitment to be there for people who you love and care for. I learned about Marshall's work through his Indian students in 2013. Shivani is here. And I was amazed as well as amused. I was like, wait, what? There is a professor who teaches a course on organizing communities? What? And I remember my first in-person meeting with Marshall in Serbia back in 2015, where we were joined by a global community of leaders and organizations who were working in Serbia, Japan, Kenya, US, all over, and were adapting the framework in their own countries. And I was young, I was naive, I was nervous, I was 26, 27 years old, and I was shivering because I had just registered Haiyya, and without knowing what it takes to build a group, a community, an organization. Well, I'm still learning. So in that whole gathering, we had to do some presentations, and I did mine about Haiyya. My face was red, flushed. And at the end of the presentation, I remember Marshall asked me, so who exactly are your people? That's one of the first questions he asked. And I said, well, everybody who's interested. And to that he said, well, and then he didn't say anything. And I did some secret sulking in my room, and then I went up to him later over lunch and asked him, can we talk? And he was like, sure, tell me about you and your story. And then, like a curious kid, he asked me questions about my life story, my experiences, my values, why I do, what I really care about. And that conversation formed the foundational moment for me as a young leader to be able to even articulate what I'm called to do with Haiyya and my people. I took Marshall's online course in 2016, and I remember listening to him and his team of teaching fellows, and along with 100 other students who were joining the course online. They were talking about stories, building teams, building relationships, building power. And I thought to myself, wow, this is incredible. I do those things on ground. I do when I work with communities. But I was never intentional. I was never attentive to these simple but significant acts of being a human. That has always been at the center of how we work as people, as communities. I then started using the framework as a very strong perspective and a guide to build Haiyya. We all at Haiyya started exploring the central question of what is the role of young people like us to build the future of this country, and what does it takes to build a space that generates and establishes political power of youth. Today, we are a 9-year-old organization that aims to build a democratic, empathetic, and equitable India where young people have the political power to shape the future as well as the current. We organize young people on the values of equity, freedom, care, and learning, and we adapted the framework to our context by doing four things that I'm going to quickly talk about. First, using the framework and its practices to build our internal team, because if we want to lead organizing efforts outside, it was important that we needed to be organized ourselves to have trust, commitment, solidarity, decision-making, and accountability that we needed as a young collective. Second, by creating campaign support and incubation programs so that we can identify campaigns that needed support to be looked at from a people-powered lens so that they can organize their communities better and win change. Third, by creating training and long-term fellowship programs where we train people into organizing, teach them organizing, and over time, kind of have a more capacity where, people who share language, share framework, are able to kind of develop more coaches, trainers year by year. The other thing that we do is by creating an ecosystem of stories, resources, inspiration, operational support, and strategic collaboration that is needed to not just do organizing, but also nurture the mindset, culture, and hope that it takes. We have been able to work with about 3,000 people in the past 9 years, train them into skilled organizing, who have further had ripple effects and engaged their own communities on issues of climate, gender, health, Adivasi rights, queer rights, and have ran more than 200 campaigns. 50 of those campaigns have seen some form of structural and systemic victories. And biggest of all is we've been able to create a pool of trainers, coaches, leaders who can then pass on that knowledge and practice to more people. But here is the real thing. It's very, very hard to find leaders, to build trust, shared values, to find purpose with a larger number of people who commit to work together, to sustain relationships, to build campaigns, to continue developing that leadership ladder of engagement, to sustain the motivation and commitment, and to prevent burnout. All of that is hard, and I know you all know, because we are all in the same boat trying to manage that and trying to do that thing. And we are doing all of that in the middle of all of this at a time with a lot of external barriers and complexities that's sometimes just impossible to make sense of. And what an ironic time to be honoring, learning, and celebrating people-powered work amidst other range of festivities that's being celebrated in the country. You know what I'm talking about. But we are here today because we want to take a moment to pause, reflect, learn, and really think about what do we mean by leadership? What are we building leadership for? How are we building it? What is working, what is not working, and how are we acting together with our communities as well as with each other? The challenge of civic leadership and the possibilities of its evolution is not an abstract, theoretical, or philosophical question. It may be, But for all of us, as people in this room, NGO leaders, practitioners, donors, movement builders, community leaders, truly it's a question of rediscovery and practice. And that's what we are going to focus and discuss today. Organizing as a form of leadership practice. What is missing in what we are doing? And what new perspectives it can offer to strengthen the work, what we are already doing. Our work with young people at Haiyya has taught us three significant things, and we are still learning more. First, organizing is relational, and you're going to hear in depth about all of this from Marshall. But organizing is relational. It's built on investing and committing time in people to interact with them as humans who have stories, experiences, dreams, and pains. It's about bridging the gap between me and you so that we can become a shared we and commit to work together. Second, bringing emotions and vulnerability at the center of our work is the only way we could move and inspire people. We share emotions and we tell stories because courage inspires courage. Authenticity inspires authenticity. Third, power is built through step-by-step commitment and actions, intentional step-by-step commitment and actions, from few to many people. And it's not just about numbers. If that number isn't helping us achieve something visible and tangible as external change, or it's not creating more leadership capacity. Enough that I've spoken. And now, without wasting much time, I want to introduce you all to Professor Marshall Ganz, who many of you already know and have heard about, his phenomenal and grounding work. Marshall is a senior lecturer in leadership, organizing, and civil society at the Kennedy School of Government. Marshall teaches, researches, and writes on leadership, narrative, strategy, and organization in social movements, civic association, and politics. During 16 years with the United Farm Workers, he gained experience in union, political, and community organizing. During the 1980s, he worked with the grassroots groups to develop new organizing programs and design innovative voter mobilization strategies. In 1991, in order to deepen his intellectual understanding of his work, he returned to Harvard College and after a 28-year leave of absence, completed his undergraduate degree in history and government. He was awarded an MPA by the Kennedy School in 1993 and completed his PhD in sociology in 2000. He has also published in American Journal of Sociology, American Prospect, Washington Post, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and elsewhere. His book, Why David Sometimes Win, Leadership, Organizing, and Strategy in California Farm Worker Movement, was published in 2009, earning Michael J. Harrington Book Award of the American Political Science Association. He has also been instrumental in 2007-2008 in the design of grassroots organization of President Obama's electoral campaign. In 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in the divinity by the Episcopal Divinity School. And in association with the Leading Change Network that Aditi spoke about, he coaches, trains, and advises a lot of civic, social, educational, healthcare, and political groups in organizing, training, and leadership development around the world. Professor Ganz, thank you for being with us today, and I invite you with a lot of gratitude to join us on the stage and share your experiences and perspectives. Can I have a big round of applause, please? Thank you.
Good morning. Namaskar. Anakam. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Namaskarum. Did I get it right? Yeah? All right. I'm learning. Usually when I welcome people with good morning, I want to be sure that people are ready to interact. So I'm going to wish you good morning again, and then I want to hear from you. Okay? Good morning.
Good morning.
A little more energy. Come on. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, that's good. That's what we're looking for. Thank you so much for this opportunity to learn with you today. I've had the good fortune of working with students from India for many years. We're all in a learning mode right now, and if we're not, we should be. Because what a time it is to be learning. My friend and former colleague, Tom Hayden, once observed that change is slow except when it's fast. And we are in a fast moment right now. And fast moments can be fraught with danger, but also opportunity. You know, at some point, the bills become due, or as we say in the States, chickens come home to roost, and we confront the consequences of many years. Inconvenient truths must be faced, like the growing and persistent inequality of many years, the role of money in our electoral systems that corrupts those systems, the roles of race, gender, class, and caste differences that can't be papered over, and the reality that a democracy that does not work for everyone cannot really work for anyone. But it can be an opportunity. It can be an opportunity to turn the urgency, the anger, the motivation of this moment into organized movement, action that can meet those challenges. And so that's what we're going to explore a bit. I do want to be clear that if you're looking for answers, you've come to the wrong place. This is not going to be here's the answer. What I've been invited to do is offer a perspective on this question, rooted in my own experience, which may or may not be useful to you. Not as some kind of model. I just want to say all models are wrong. And what I mean by that is that any model is an abstraction of the complex reality that is intended to describe. I prefer to think of, instead of models, as lenses. Lenses on complex reality that allow us to see particular things and make decisions about those things. So there is no one model at all. What there is constant learning. So this afternoon, hopefully, we'll benefit from this approach. Now, for me, the place to start is leadership. And that word has so many different definitions. At the Kennedy School, every class on leadership, of which there are many, uses some other definition. So I want to be clear what I'm talking about when I'm talking about leadership. It's rooted in three questions posed by a first century Jerusalem scholar, Rabbi Hillel, who, when asked, how do I figure out what to do with my life, responded with three questions to ask yourself. First, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not meant to be a selfish question. It is meant to be self-regarding. In other words, what values do you bring? What are your expectations? How can you approach with enough self-awareness to actually be able to see others? But the second question is, if I'm for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a human being and not a thing, a person and not a what, is to recognize that we exist in relationships in the world, and our capacity to realize our own goals can't be separated from the capacity of others to realize theirs. And finally, he says, ask yourself, if not now, when? Not meant to advise jumping into moving traffic. It's a caution against what Jane Addams calls the snare of preparation. Just another year of strategic planning. We'll have the perfect plan. We'll implement, and then the world will totally conform to our expectations. Has that ever happened to you? Never happened to me. Never happened to me. See, the point is that in order to learn to do well what we want to do, we have to begin to do it. That understanding flows from action, not preceding it. And so for me, leadership is about the interaction of these three elements of self, with other, with action. Now, the other point about leadership is, when does it matter? Have you had the experience of when things are going great in your organization that there's a line of people saying, where's the leadership so we can thank them? When does that line form outside your office? When? When things are going great? Come on, be honest here. Isn't it the problems, the challenges, the dilemmas, the contradictions? See, when the system's working fine, what do you need leadership for? See, it's the challenges, the surprises, the unexpected. That's when the creative, adaptive, initiative-taking work of leadership is required. And so it's daunting to actually accept that there will never be the day when everything is under control. That just will never happen, not in my role in leadership. So it's important then to think of leadership as not simply a matter of the hands, what new skills might I need for this, or a matter of the head, how can I use my resources in new ways to deal with these new challenges? Challenge of the head. And then there's, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How Do you inspire the hope and courage in others to take the risks that are often involved in dealing with real change? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's a way of thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way. There's often so much emphasis on the hands that heart is skipped over. And it turns out that really turns out to be the main source of motivation. Now, organizing, and the other thing I just want to say about that is, this is a way of looking at leadership not as a position, but as a practice. I don't have to go too far to think of examples of people who occupy positions of formal leadership, but turn out to be awful leaders. In my country, I'm an expert on that. But on the other hand, we meet people in neighborhoods, at kitchen tables, in workplaces who are exercising leadership in the way I'm describing it, without the titles, without the distinctions, without the resumes, because that's what they do within their communities. So we're thinking leadership not as something you are, but as something you do, a practice of leadership. Now, organizing is a particular form of leadership. And it begins by asking the first question, not what is my issue, but who are my people? With whom am I entering into this relationship to do what we're going to do? Who are my people? And then second, what is the change they need? Not because I think they need it, but because they do. What are the pain points? What are the hope points? What is real in terms of lived experience? And finally, how can I work with them to enable them to use resources they have, which may not be lots of money, resources they have to turn into the power they need to achieve the change that they want. So organizing is not about providing services to clients. It's a very nice thing. It's not organizing. It's not about marketing products to customers. That's fine. It's not even advocating for others in lieu of others advocating for themselves. So organizing is a way of constructing what we call constituency. Now, constituency comes from, it's used for many different things, but it comes from the Latin constare, which means to stand together. And so the idea in organizing is to bring people together, to stand together, learn together, decide together, act together, and hopefully win together. Now, so constituency is the key question for us in organizing. Who are your people? Who are you engaging with? And in what way are you engaging them to enable them to exercise the power they need to change things? And that's the other thing that organizing is about. It's all about power. And often when I say that word, people, ooh, power, that's scary. I think it's often because the people who have a lot of it don't want the rest of us to talk about it or notice. I like that in Spanish, the word is poder, which just means to be able to accomplish that which we want to accomplish. And it's also intuitive. If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? If you need what I've got more than I need what you've got, who's got the power? And what if it's reversed? See, I think power is not a thing you have. Power is a relationship of influence based on the balance between needs and resources. In other words, it is a form of interdependence. Now, it can be extractive and exploitative, or it can be enhancing and empowering. But that's the point. So if I may own the only food store in town, but the followers of Gandhi arrived and they're all on a fast, my power just went away. Nobody needs that resource that I have. I find it a much more helpful way to think of power as something that can be generated out of the mutual needs for resources and interests. And that's another piece that we're going to focus on. Now, finally, the impact, when we're looking at successful organizing, we're looking for three outcomes, not just one. One is, did we win the campaign, or did we win the project? Did we accomplish our goals? That's very important. But the second is, perhaps even more important, did we come out of this stronger rather than weaker? You ever been in a project or a campaign where you never want to see anybody ever again who was in it? You may have won. I see a smile over there. Yeah, see, if you look at what happened, yeah, you won this, but where's your power? See, the power is collective, and it's an organization, and it's an empowered community that wasn't before. So unless that element is present in organizing, it's missing the whole point. The third is developing leadership. We're going to talk more about that, but unless we're developing leadership, that is the capacity to enable others to work together to achieve shared purpose, as we're doing what we're doing, then we're missing the critical resource we need to grow, to deepen, and to expand what we're trying to do. One other point I want to make, there can be a lot of confusion between mobilizing and organizing. These days, the internet has made it much cheaper to share information. You know, it used to be to share information, to get people to show up at a rally, you had to build relationships, you had to develop, you had to, well, now if there's a motivating cause, you just put the word out and a bunch of people show up. And then it doesn't usually produce anything. And then the mystery is, well, why? Well, nothing was built. Nothing was built. Nothing was created. It was a moment, like a tactic in search of a strategy, but it didn't produce what we're trying to. You know, El Ghanim was at the Harvard at school for a while. He was the Google guy involved in Tahrir Square in Arab Spring, and they very successfully mobilized lots of people, enough to get rid of Mubarak. But if you look at who walked away with the reward, who was it? Muslim Brotherhood. They were organized, they were ready, they were prepared, and so they were able to benefit. So when we're talking about organizing, we're not just talking about mobilizing. We're talking about mobilizing as a piece of organizing, but organizing is much more fundamental. Now, organizing has been around for a long time. It wasn't just invented last week, 10 years ago. It's, I think, as old as ever. Any time that people have joined together to find ways to correct injustice that they are suffering, it's organizing. I mean, everybody know what a boycott is? Boycott? You know where it comes from? It comes from a little island off the coast of England, known as Ireland. And there were British landlords who were, you know, dominating the thing. And there were tenant farmers, and these tenant farmers, the deal was that he would improve the property and they would share their produce with him. Well, he wasn't doing that, so they stopped. And so for 6 months they didn't do that. And in the end they won. His name was Captain Boycott. So this is how he's memorialized, as the guy responsible. But boycotts have been around much longer than that. And my point is that this is not some new weird thing. It's something with us. Now, my introduction to this work of organizing was in June of 1964 when I was a junior at Harvard College. And I volunteered for the Mississippi Summer Project. Now, the Mississippi Summer Project was an effort to support the work of African-American organizers in Mississippi who were challenging the whole racist system, but in particular, challenging the political exclusion of African-Americans, fighting for the right to vote and for it actually to be. Now, the challenge was that they kept getting beaten, put in jail, or worse, because the law didn't protect them. So the idea was, let's bring some people who might bring the law with them, like college students from elite colleges, black and white. Maybe they'll bring the law with them. And we were and our mission was to organize something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was a parallel organization to the racist Democratic Party. And the idea was to go and challenge, get them thrown out at the National Convention. We were in a place called Oxford, Ohio, where we were being trained. There were about 300 of us. And it was the night before it was time to go to Mississippi. Now, and we got word that 3 of our party had disappeared. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. They had gone down 3 days before to investigate the burning of a black church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, hadn't been heard from since. Bob Moses, the lead organizer, who was a very soft-spoken guy, called us all together, like in an auditorium, called us all together, and he got up on the stage, and he said, "We heard what happened to our brothers. We don't know exactly what happened, but we think they're gone. And sure enough, 2 months later, their bullet-riddled, beaten bodies were found buried in a dirt levee where the Klan had buried them after executing them because the county sheriff had turned them over to the Klan for that purpose. Now, we didn't know that then, but we kind of knew it. And so Bob said, look, I'd like to tell everybody, just forget about it. You don't need to go. He said, but I can't. I have to ask you to go. He said, but he couldn't take the whole responsibility. So everybody here decide. And, you know, if you decide you can't go, there's no shame. There's no shame. But everybody needs to decide. Well, I sank into my chair, just like everybody in that room, in utter silence. And I think everyone, certainly I was asking myself, why am I here? What am I doing here? Is this what I signed up for? My father was a rabbi, my mother a teacher. We lived in Germany for 3 years after the Second World War, and a lot of his work was with Holocaust survivors. One of my uncles had been deported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered. My 5th birthday party was actually in a DP, displaced person camp, that was all children, which I thought was pretty cool until I realized why it was only children. The parents were gone. So the Holocaust was a reality in our home, but my parents interpreted it to me as not being simply about anti-Semitism, but about racism. And that when you turn people into objects, you can do anything, no holds barred. And the civil rights movement was fighting the institutionalized racism that's been part of my country since before its founding. Now, as a rabbi's kid, now I don't know how well this translates. There's a sort of category of people: preachers' kids, rabbis' kids. Your father, your mother was a priest or a minister, and you're supposed to show up everywhere. You're also supposed to be perfect, which is a different set of issues that we have special support groups to deal with. But I did love one ceremony particularly, and it was the telling of the Exodus story, the story of a journey of people from slavery to freedom. And every year that would be told. And they would point to the children and say, you were slaves in Egypt. I said, I've never been a slave, I've never been to Egypt. It took a while to figure out what it meant was that story is not the property of one people or one time or one place. It's told generation after generation. You have to figure out where you are in it. Are you with those guys with the horses and the chariots? Or are you with the people who are trying to find their way to a land of promise? Well, Dr. King described the civil rights movement as yet another chapter in that story. Now, I was 20 at the time. Others were 18, 19, 21, 22. The civil rights movement in the US was a movement of young people. It's really important to understand that. You know, there's a Protestant theologian who wrote a book called Prophetic Imagination, where he says that transformational vision occurs at the intersection of criticality, a clear view of the world's pain, and hope, a sense of the world's promise and possibility. Young people, and one without the other leads to despair or to irrelevance. But together they can generate a powerful tension for transformation. And young people come of age with a critical eye on the world. They find an almost of necessity hopeful hearts. There's a deep affinity between generation change and social change. And it certainly was for my generation, and I certainly hope it is for this one. As we're sitting there in silence, a young woman named Jean Wheeler stands up in the back of the room. She starts to sing. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long. We must be free. They say freedom is a constant dying. We've died too long. We must be free. And as she stood up and began to walk out of the room, everybody filed in behind her, and the next day everybody went to Mississippi. Now for me, that was a real turning point for me, because it was in Mississippi that I would really discover what would be my calling for the rest of my life. You know, my education about race, power, and politics in America, with all due respect to Harvard, began in Mississippi. The inequalities were so stark: housing, healthcare, education. Whites were here and blacks were here. But it was also clear that if you tried to do something about that, you'd get pushback, because the reality was there was a community benefiting from that, as well as a community that was suffering from that. So the idea was, okay, let's go to the government in Washington, D.C., and they'll fix it. Hi, Washington, could we have a little bit of your power? Well, that didn't work too well. What we realized was, unless the people themselves
could be authors of their own power, it simply wasn't going to change because it wasn't anybody else's interest in particular for it to change. What am I talking about? We learned that there's a difference between resources and power. And we all learned from the example of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 that began the modern civil rights movement in the United States. How many people have heard of Rosa Parks? Okay, and what you probably heard is that she was a lady who one day was tired and wouldn't get up and give her a seat, and so she was arrested. She was actually secretary of the NAACP chapter. She was trained in organizing. The whole thing was strategic. So she gets arrested, goes to jail, but then the women's committee at the Black College says, we can't let her go to jail by herself. We got to show more solidarity. And they went and convinced Dr. King and the others to call a one-day boycott. Everybody stay off the buses. And there's a great account of Dr. King getting up early in the morning. He sees the buses go by, and there isn't a single black face on a single bus. Now, at that moment, that community saw itself differently. Powerlessness fragments you, but that kind of solidarity empowers you. And so that night, they decided, well, we stayed off one day, we're just going to stay off till we win. Took a year, but they did win. And in the course of that, they learned that everyone in that community had relevant resources. What am I talking about? What were the key resources needed for that boycott to work? Any ideas? What do you see when you look down? What do you see? Feet. Turns out everybody had feet. Now, if they use their feet to walk to work and deny the bus company the bus fare, instead of using their feet to get on the bus and give the bus company the bus fare, their individual dependency on the bus company turned into the bus company's dependency on a united community. And that transformation from individual dependency to collective power, for me, that's what organizing is about. So I got hooked. It was time to go back to school. I actually wrote him a letter. How can I come back and study history when we're busy making it, which was arrogant, but also true. Instead, I went back home to California after 2 years in the South, where I had grown up in Bakersfield, which is an oil and agriculture town in the San Joaquin Valley. And a man named Cesar Chavez had just begun organizing migrant farm workers, mostly immigrants from Mexico. There was no union for farm workers, just as there has been no union for domestic workers. In the US, it's because they were excluded from labor legislation, mainly because they were black and brown. So this was an effort to build power from that community. And it was interesting because I'd grown up in that community, but I hadn't seen it. I had to go to Mississippi, get what we call Mississippi eyes, come back home, see another community of people of color, also without political rights, also without economic protections. And California, with its own rich history of racial oppression, going back to the native peoples, to the Chinese, the Japanese, immigrant group after immigrant group brought to do the work in the fields. And then once they got organized, another group would be called. There is a whole period in which Sikh workers were brought to, especially the sugar beets and the South. It was a system that was designed to disempower. But what I realized then was that Mississippi was not an exception to America. It was an example of the America we needed to change. And that is what then engaged me in this work. For the next 16 years, I worked with the United Farm Workers. And we did community organizing, labor organizing. My first political campaign was Senator Kennedy in 1968, when we turned out the Latino vote in East Los Angeles, won the primary for him, but an assassin took him from us that night. But it was a place of learning organizing as a craft, not just like, let's be one with the people kind of thing. And learning it as a craft was so valuable. And so I left the Farm Workers in 1981, did another 10 years of mostly electoral union issue organizing, mostly in California. And then it was when I was invited to my 25th reunion at Harvard, even though I was a dropout. Now, I was a little surprised because there was a dropout up in Seattle who started a small software company with which you may be familiar, speaking of Bill Gates and Microsoft. That was not my situation. But I was feeling stuck, and it was like running into a 20-year-old version of me. And 20-year-old me says, how's it going? I said, I'm feeling stuck. Well, come back and finish that senior year. I don't know, the synapses may not work, tuition had changed, a little bit, but we figured it out. So in 1991, I came back, finished my wrote a senior thesis in history and government, and graduated class of 64-92. And my 81-year-old mother got to come and see her son finally become a college graduate, so I got to close that particular loop. But I got hooked, did a master's at the Kennedy School, then a PhD in sociology. And while I was working on that, was asked to design a course at the Kennedy School on organizing. Now that turned out to be a gift to me, because it was a way I could integrate my life experience with the social science I was learning in a pedagogical conversation with a rising generation. I mean, it was like, I get to go to class twice a week and have a conversation with the future. I mean, how cool is that? So I've been on the faculty full-time since 2000, teach organizing online and offline, public narrative online and offline, and got back into the world of practice largely through my students and their involvement, particularly in the Obama campaign in 2007. And since then, working with people in different parts of the world who are trying to figure out how to turn their values into sources of power to create a world into which they want their children to live. So that has been a great gift to me, a great, something I'm continually grateful for. And so it's kind of a seeding, and it will grow. So what I'm going to share with you is this approach, this set of practices that come out of that experience and that study and that work and lots of teaching. And let me just say again, this is not about, this is how it must be. We really get in trouble with that. The world's complex, life is complex. So what we're looking at really are ways, practices in which everyone can do it. It's like not organizing as, a PhD requirement. And I'll explain more what I mean in a moment. But first of all, how many people have ever been in a disorganization? You ever been in a disorganization? Oh, one hand, the hands are going up, all right. So we tried to define the characteristics of a disorganization. One is division. I don't mean difference of opinion, I mean division. When you get to doing stuff, people are fighting each other. There's apathy. Nobody shows up when you need them to show up. It's reactive. Nobody's taking initiative, but when somebody over there decides something that affects the group, everybody runs around like chickens with their heads cut off. There may be resources, but they're not being deployed, and there's a sense of drift. Let me see again. Who's experienced that sort of thing? Not so great, is it? So, and it's particularly problematic if our power depends on our collective action. And that's what's happening to us. We got no power. So we put together then the promised land. What does it look like when it really works? That instead of division, there's unity. Again, I don't mean no dissent. What I mean is when decisions are made, we're unified. Instead of apathy, there's motivation. Instead of reactiveness, there's initiative. Instead of inertia, there's change. Instead of drift, there's purpose. So then the question, how many people have been in this, have had this experience? It is so different from the other one, isn't it? And so we began looking at, well, what makes the difference? So here revealed for the first time, sort of, are these practices of leadership. In other words, if there's unity instead of division, people are working at building relationships as the foundation. If there's motivation instead of apathy, people have figured out how to turn the emotional resources embedded in their values into the motivation to act. If there's initiative instead of reactiveness, someone's strategizing. If there's change instead of inertia, real action is happening, not theoretical action, real. And if there's purpose instead of drift, it's because they've created a structure that allows them to coordinate, to make decisions, to hold themselves accountable. So what we're going to do now is look at each of these. This is the approach we take to training and organizing and classes and workshops and campaigns. That the idea is how to turn constituency resources into the power to achieve goals through these 5 practices. And that's what we're going to get into now. So first, how's everybody doing? You all right out there?
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
All right, just checking. So, relationships. How many people ever had a relationship? Let me see. I didn't see a good one. Okay, relationship. All right. And so then the question is, what does it take to form a relationship? This is something we all do. Now sometimes people will say, oh, it's trust. Well, trust comes from a relationship. How do you trust someone before you're in a relationship with them? It's because we're all the same. Well, that's a pretty boring relationship, isn't it? There's not much happening there. So the point is to draw attention, next slide, to the fact that at the core of every relationship, there is some kind of exchange of interest and resource, You may have information that benefits me. I may be a good listener, and that will benefit you. So it's not like financial exchange or transactional exchange, but there is a mutual benefit of some kind that's there. But then again, sometimes we've had the experience, I know my students have, you meet someone, you say, oh, there's a lot of, this is very interesting, why don't we have coffee? So the two of you have coffee, and the coffee's great. You say, oh, this was really good, so let's continue next week. And the person says, I have an exam next week. Well, what about the next week? I got a family coming from out of town. What about the next week? I'll send you an email. Okay, what just happened? What just happened? I don't know if you use the word dump. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened. Because what was missing to turn the transaction into a relationship is commitment. It's the risk of committing, yes, let's continue, let's explore, let's continue. And enough commitment to actually give it life, because transactions don't go anywhere, but relationships have a future. Relationships are a way to grow, a way to learn, a way to understand. And so for me, this dynamic of relationship is absolutely fundamental to this kind of work. Because if we're not building those kinds of commitments to each other, then what are we building? And it may sound very theoretical, but we were all trained in what's called a one-on-one meeting, which is meeting with someone one-on-one, but it's not about sign my petition or come to my meeting. It's, let me learn more about who you are, why you care. Let me share something myself. So you have enough information to decide if there's enough of a values commonality to commit. Because no commitment doesn't happen. So that sounds very, how can I say, minor, one-on-one meeting. What we learned though is it can become geometric. By one person inviting people they know to their house, and then get 3 of those to have a meeting, and then 3 of those. I don't know if they have Tupperware here, but Tupperware has a whole sales operation in this. But what you're doing is really building on social networks, and you're learning who the leaders are by the people who can get people to come to their house. And so this, we did 500 of these in South Carolina, which is how we built the campaign that won for Obama. Hillary was being supported by all the establishment. So we have to build something from the ground up and scratch, and this is how we did it. So there is a way to then build relationships into sources of power. Now, the next practice is public narrative. Now, public narrative, okay. Let's go to that next slide. Okay. What makes a story is that it is an episode or a moment in which a protagonist is confronted with a challenge. Then the question is, how do they respond? And based on how they respond, we learn what we call moral. Now, the important thing about it is, though, that the experience, because it's recounted as an experience, a moment, it has emotional content. See, how did it feel? Where did the fear go? How was the fear overcome with hope? There's an emotional content that is really what's being communicated, not lessons to the head, but to the heart. And to do narrative, it requires to learn to speak the language of emotion. Now, sometimes people say, language of emotion, don't get out of here. We want all rational. So, well, then you have a sociopath, is what you have, because human beings, we are emotional, we're physical, we're cognitive creatures. And so the language of emotion, music speaks the language of emotion, worship speaks the language of emotion. So poetry speaks the language of emotion, so it's not such a weird thing to understand that narrative also speaks the language of emotion. But it speaks it with respect to a particular kind of thing, which is a disruption that can be experienced as a threat or as a challenge. If it turns into fear, then it becomes, if it's interpreted as a threat, fear takes hold. If it's interpreted as a challenge, hope can take over. So a whole lot of the work is to figure out how to transform fear into hope, isolation into solidarity, and a sense of self-worth, and a sense of self-doubt into a sense of self-worth. So this is kind of the fundamental thing. Now sometimes, like up at the top, people aren't seeing what's coming in their way with the clarity. Climate change is a great example of this. And so when that's the case, we have to figure out how to make it urgent. Because urgency is a way of establishing priority. You know, if you have an exam tomorrow morning, but you're trying to decide about the rest of your life, what are you going to do tonight? I know what you should do tonight. Study for the exam. No, and there's two ways to think about urgency. One is urgency of need. Like when they were putting, they were separating children from families on my border and putting them in cages. Now, that's something that should not go on another day. That's an urgent need. But there's also urgency of opportunity. Like, there's 3 days left until the election. So unless we produce in these 3 days, we miss the shot. So it's a combination of those that can generate urgency. Now, I have anger up there, and I don't mean rage. I do mean outrage. I mean, I don't know how many people saw the image of George Floyd being murdered by a policeman in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And when you see that, that's outrageous. See, it's a deep dissonance between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And that feeling of dissonance can be a very powerful motivator. It can be a powerful motivator if it's coupled with hope. If it's coupled with fear, it goes just the opposite direction. It becomes mobilizing around fear, hate, and all the rest of it. But if it's coupled with hope, it becomes mobilizing around solidarity, interdependence, and so forth. So the narrative work is to harness this power, to communicating to others why you've been called, why you care, not your degrees, why you care, what's in your life experience. We had Aprajita share an experience with her brother this morning. I mean, those kinds of things we may think they're trivial, they're not, because it's where we learn to care. And then the question becomes, where did you get your hope? What experiences? I mean, how many people here have ever had an experience of hurt? Let me see. You ever had an experience of hurt? Anybody's got that? How about experience of hope? Having experience of... See, if you had to experience the hurt, you wouldn't think the world needed fixing. And if you had to have the hope, you wouldn't think you could. It's very important to recognize our own resources for hope within us. So the point is that the story of self then is to communicate to others why you've been called. And usually it's those hope and hurt experiences. Then the story of us is what experiences do we share that creates common values among us so that we can connect with one another. It's not a category, it's an experience. It's not a categorical us, everyone who has green eyes or something. It is experiential. And then how to turn the current moment into a story moment, a moment in which there is a real challenge, in which there is a source of hope, and there are choices we need to make in order to move forward. That's basically the work, and it's heart work, and it's fundamental to the rest. Now, if we go to the next slide, oh yeah, this is just an example of a wonderful use of public narrative with my colleague Nasreen Hajjaj in Amman. The folks you see here are people who became leaders in a campaign on literacy in a place called Jabal Naif. And what was so powerful was the relational work, but also as they began to claim their own stories. Not somebody's sister, not somebody's daughter, claim their own stories. And of course it did create some tensions at home. But what they found was that then working with others, they could become real agents of change. And they did a literacy campaign, then based on that they did a Safe Homes campaign to stop child beating and domestic violence. Then they did a campaign on corporal punishment to stop children being beaten in schools. And it became this whole wellspring because leadership development was at the center of it, and the narrative work turned out to be a crucial part of that, to be able to find, yes, I am who I am with you, and so forth. There are many other examples. This is one of the earliest examples of this sort of thing. Now, third, let's go to strategizing. So, what is strategy? Okay, what is the answer? Oh, okay. The clearest definition I've found of strategy is that it's turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. Now, this is another thing, like storytelling and like relationship building, that we all do, and we do it all the time. Ever overslept for a meeting or overslept for a class, and you had to figure out how to get there on time despite the fact that you missed the bus or whatever? Has that ever happened to you? Yeah, of course. What you were doing was strategizing. You were saying, oh, obstacle. So now I need to figure out, I need to use my creativity to figure out an alternate way to use my resources to still get there. And so we do this all the time. Now, in the context of organizing, it's critical. And it's critical to think of it as a verb rather than a noun. In other words, once you have a campaign, once you have a plan, strategic plan, don't have to worry about it anymore. Forget it. That's really when the strategizing work begins. General Eisenhower, after the invasion in Normandy, was asked about the importance of planning. He said, planning is really important, but plans are useless. And his point was that once you encounter the real world, that's when you need to begin to learn. So that's why we think of it as a verb, not as a noun. Unless there's a capacity for sustained learning, it freezes and it becomes irrelevant. Now, the word strategy comes from the Greek strata. Strata was the word for a field. The army their job was to take the field, so the army was called a strata. And the general was called the strategos. And there's a strategos up on the mountain. And his job was to develop a theory of change. I mean, that's really what it was. A hypothesis, if I deploy my people this way and they do that, well, then we can win. That's what a theory of change is. Now, the troops down in the valley, they were called tacticas. And this is where we get strategy and tactics. Strategy being the theory, tactics being the actions, the activities. And they're interdependent. You know, people say, we're having a rally. Why? Well, we always do that. Is that a tactic? No, it's just an action. It has no meaning because it's not embedded in a strategy. And so they're interdependent in an important way. Now the problem comes, and I think we have now a dramatic showing of the problem coming. Aha, yes. Now the problem comes when the cloud settles between these two. And the guy up on the hill, the people on the hill, they think they got the whole truth because they got the big picture, right? So they see the whole truth. Then the folks down here in the valley, no, they got the whole truth because they're intimately familiar with the context there. Now the reality is neither one has the whole truth. They need each other to be able to both appreciate the context for strategic work and be able to put that context in a broader context. So it's kind of how to balance, and this is one place lots of organizations really get in trouble, where local groups say, we know it all, or the national group says, we know it all, and they're both wrong because they need each other to actually flourish. Next slide. Oh yeah, this is a chart that has needed reform because it looks like strategy is a straight line. This is much more what strategy looks like. I think when you're doing it, it's much more zigzaggy than that. Next slide. Okay, and we can talk. We can talk more about strategy. I do want to emphasize this whole thing about resources and turning resources into power. You know, the example we talked about, the Montgomery bus boycott, the fundamental resource was what? The fundamental resource was what? Their feet. Their feet. See, it wasn't that they had PhDs, it was their feet. You know, in the Boston Tea Party in the United States, where they dumped the tea in the harbor, It was a tea boycott, but the purpose was to affect the British government on taxes and to affect the tea merchants in Britain in order to cost them, so that it would be more costly for them to resist than to accept the changes that were coming. In my experience in the Farm Workers Union, it took us 5 years. We organized a boycott of California grapes. We taught people to not eat California grapes and supermarkets not to sell them. It took us 5 years. We had 1.5 million people. But no one would think not eating a grape could turn into power. But see, it can. If it's collective, if it's strategic, and it's based on an actual understanding of the power dynamics. So that's a point I want to make on that. Okay, now, action. When I first learned organizing, I was told, if you can't count it, it didn't happen. Now, that's not to put any kind of metrics up high, because there's all kinds of metrics that are way wrong. They satisfy maybe what a funder wants, but they're not relevant to what the organizing project is. But, you know, I had to, how many people came to the meeting? How many didn't? Who were they? It was a real commitment to understand the detail of craft on what was happening and what wasn't happening. If we didn't do that, we couldn't learn. We were just sort of gesturing. Now, what it means here, the way I'm using it, is that action is the mobilization and deployment of resources. The feet of the people in Montgomery were mobilized and deployed in the form of a boycott. Funds, dues in an organization can be mobilized, individual, turned into collective power. So there's this pattern, this interdependence between mobilization and deployment. You get into trouble when that little diagram gets smaller and smaller because it needs to grow. And so when I was in the Farm Workers, we went nowhere without two things, a can and a clipboard. What do you think the purpose was? What was the purpose of the can? What was the purpose of the clipboard? The can, right? Can was for money, and the clipboard? Volunteers, yeah, volunteers. It was like people and money. And we knew we needed to find ways to generate that. We got so good, we could raise like about $3,000 a day in New York City with cans and signs saying boycott lettuce by standing at the places where people came in and left. And one day I was walking along with a cup of coffee and my sign, and somebody just tossed a quarter into my cup of coffee. They've been so well trained that that's what we were doing. But the thing about it here is the relationship, the interdependence between the two, and not kidding yourself, but really seeing clearly what you're doing. And it takes commitment, and it takes motivation, and there's a lot more to that. But have you ever had the experience of asking someone to come to a meeting and they say, I'll try? And then you say, oh, that's a yes. Is it a yes?
No.
It's not. See, you need the yes and you need the no, because you learn from the no. And see, if it's one of these fudgy things like, oh, they'll try, maybe they'll be there. Come on, you're just kidding yourself. So there's something about really being clear about what's there and what isn't there. It's not offensive. It's like getting to what's real. And then you can learn from that, how to get to what's real. Okay. This is an example of some very effective action. This is the new mayor of Toronto, Canada, Olivia Chow. She was actually leading a training center for us in Toronto, and then did a whole organizing campaign. And what they were trying to do was turn people into votes. And they succeeded. And it was not expected to happen, but it did. And so, you know, this was kind of cool. We got to go up there and, you know, spend some time celebrating. But it wasn't a money campaign. It was a people campaign. And so it's just another example of how action, well understood, can produce real results. Next slide. Okay, the last is structure. Now, I don't know about here, but where I come from, you say structure, everybody starts to quiver because it feels like, oh, oppression is coming, because we've all been stuck in oppressive structures. The point is, structure, it comes from the Latin structa, which just means to build. In other words, a structure is a way of building for the future. Anytime we commit with another person that we're going to meet again, we're creating structure. Anytime we decide our regular meetings, we're creating structure. Anytime we decide how we're going to make decisions, we're creating structure. And see, without those structures to enable our effective coordination, learning, follow-up, strategizing, and all the rest, it too often turns into no structure is chaos. And maybe that only happens in the US, but it is a real problem. Structure is not the same thing as domination. It's not the same thing as oppression. It is the commitments we make to one another about how we're going to work together. And if we need to make those commitments in order to proceed, how to make decisions, commitments, time. I don't know, you ever been in a meeting where you spent half the meeting explaining to the people that didn't come to the last meeting what happened? That only happens in the States. No, just think about how disrespectful and wasteful that is. You got people sitting there for the whole meeting. They went to the last meeting, so now they got to hear the whole thing over again because some people thought they were so privileged they didn't need to come. So this is real. This is talking about just being real about this sort of thing. Our time is our most precious resource, and if we're wasting it in that way or disrespecting it in that way, we disrespect ourselves and the whole thing of what we're trying to do. Okay, now leadership. So leadership development, which is our topic, and leadership development is, for me, it's the fundamental practice of all this stuff. Because it's about how to recruit, identify, and develop people capable of exercising these 5 practices. Whether it's at a small scale, a large scale, whatever, online or in person. But it's people who can take the responsibility for enabling others in this way. That's what makes a leader. Now, sometimes, this is the typical model of leadership, right? You see the dot? Have you ever been a dot? Let's be honest. You ever been a dot? Everything comes to you. Everything comes to you. That never happened to anybody here. Come on. Have you ever tried to work with a dot? Yeah. Oh, that resonates a lot. See, it's a real problem because we think of leadership in this very individualistic way. But see, nobody can do everything. Nobody's great at everything. And sort of when we wind up with we react to it so much that we say, we're not going to have any leaders, we're not going to have any structure, well, then you get this, which is what the feminist sociologist Joe Freeman calls tyranny of structurelessness. And her point is that people, anytime people get together, they're going to form some kind of structure. Only it won't be visible, it won't be transparent, it'll be off the books. And then you'll say, well, who decided that? Well, wait, what about you? It's all that confusion that can be avoided. And so what we've been doing since the Obama campaign is developing leadership teams. And leadership teams, not like 30 people, not like whoever happens to show up, but a team that is just as real as a cricket team, a soccer team, a string quartet, where each person has a clear role and responsibility to provide leadership on. And the point is then the team becomes interdependent. I need you to succeed for me to succeed. We're not competing with each other to say who's greater, but I'm trying to assure your success and vice versa. And the way you get to that is through the work we saw in the previous slide. It's working to generate a shared purpose, a genuinely shared purpose, and that often comes out of values. It's not just tactical. You know, sometimes we get confused between an issue and a value. It's kind of like, well, for example, I'm a tree person and you're a fish person. So now I'm all trees, you're all fish. And so we can't work together because of that. Oh, and we're competing for the same donor, right? Now, how dumb is that? Because we share a reverence for the natural world. We share a reverence, and so that's the values piece. Then we're deciding on an issue because it's a strategic choice that we can make to advance those values. If we don't do that, the issue becomes the value. And it gets very confusing then, very confusing. then anybody who disagrees, oh, you're other. We don't want to talk to you. And it leads to a lot of purism and a lot of that stuff. So building a leadership team can be a very powerful mechanism. Then we were struggling with scale. And so we realized that each team member could form their own team. And then each of them could form their own team. And it was a way to build leadership out deeply into the constituency that we were organizing. And up to this point, before this, the Obama, it was all like individual precinct. They burn out, and they need to be replaced. Boy, this changed a lot because the combination of accountability and motivation was just very, very powerful. Okay, last thing now is time, and I see we're getting to time. So. Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, wrote a book called Time's Arrow. And he argues that time is constructed in two different ways. One, he calls time as a cycle, the annual rhythm, the rhythm of continuity. The annual budget review, the annual meeting, and that's important to sustain continuity. But he says the other is time as an arrow, which he says is the rhythm of change. In other words, it's intense, it's focused, it has an end, it has a beginning, and it is intended to create change, not simply maintain continuity. Now, campaigns are structured this way because it's time as an arrow. You have a start, you have a goal. Now, the humps in between there are the point that rarely do you start a campaign with all the resources you need to win. Certainly in politics is how it works. And so what you're doing is building the resources you need in the course of the campaign. So for example, you build foundation, which can take a long time working in a community. Then you have a kickoff. Well, that's when you try to get people together and you say, campaign now begins, everybody. And we shift time. And our first goal is that first peak. We need to identify 500 people to be part of our operation here. Okay, we got to 500, great. Now we need to organize them in teams. We need X number of teams. So now we get to the teams. Now we got enough teams that we can go out and recruit voters or whatever it is. So each peak is another level of capability. So in the course of the campaign, we're creating more capacity. And that capacity is based on people power. It's based on growing the capacity. So this organizational type cycle, time is continuity, and time of change. Too often, campaigns kind of exist apart from continuity. Let's have a campaign. Let's have a campaign. The campaign's over. Where does all the power go? Unless we're building organization. See, when I was in the farmers, we had a lot of campaigns, but we were building a union. We had an organizational vision of how to sustain the power that we were building and not just have it pass away. And it goes to that second critical outcome of coming out stronger rather than weaker. So there is a place for both of these. And the problem comes when the second captures the first, or the first is done without any reference to the second. So, it's like so many things. The extremes are always wrong. It's always the place of balance, the tension there, that is a challenge to our creativity, which is where real craft is. Okay, last thing now, I think. Last thing. How many people have learned to ride a bicycle?
What?
Learn to ride a bicycle. If you learn to ride a bicycle, learn to ride a bicycle. And you learn by studying bicycleology, right? or YouTube, or what did you have to do?
Get on the cycle.
And you get on the bike, and what's the first thing that happened? Okay, and that's your moment of truth. You go home and go to bed, or you find the courage to get back up knowing that you're going to keep falling for a while because it's the only way you can learn to keep your balance. In my experience, that's how we learn any practice. We don't try to be perfect. We get into action and we begin to learn from the action that we're taking. So for the trainings and workshops that we do, we with intentionality, create a context in which this is what we expect. There's an educational psychologist, Carol Dweck, who distinguishes between what she calls growth mindset and fixed mindset. Fixed mindset, I experience critical feedback as judgment. I am smart, I am dumb, I am whatever. And naturally our defenses kick in. But when we receive critical feedback, on our work. It's data that we need in order to learn. And so it's creating a context in which we can embrace growth mindset so we can learn with each other and not pretend and not claim to excellence we don't have so we can get real excellence. I hope this makes sense because it's really kind of fundamental. The other thing that goes with it is the craft of coaching. And coaching not as, well, coaching is how to support someone who has a project, a project, and sort of how can you support them. One thing coaching is not is giving advice. No advice allowed. When we train people in this, somebody's got a leadership challenge, somebody else is going to coach them, no advice. What you learn to do is ask good questions. And by asking good questions, you enable the other person to access their own information and develop their own capacity. If you just give advice, the next time there's a problem, they're going to keep coming back to you. It's like a yo-yo. And that doesn't grow anything. But when you elicit development in the other person, then you're growing. My mom was a teacher. She called herself an educator because she pointed out that education, the root, educare, is a Latin root, and it means to draw out, not to infuse. So she never thought of education as filling people's heads with facts, but rather drawing out of people their capabilities, their motivation for learning. And that's what coaching is all about. So, I guess well, I'll just say, one of the big surprises for me was the fact that this stuff turned out to be portable. And I think it is portable because it's rooted in core human practices. We tell stories, we build relationships, we create structure, we strategize, we do all this. And so it's making the implicit explicit so we can bring craft and purpose to it. And so whether it's in the form of a workshop or a class or a campaign or a project, whether it was in Japan or Mexico or Serbia, people have found, well, the best description was in Jordan, a woman named Samar Lulin said, oh, I see, this is not a blueprint, this is a roadmap. I said, yes, it's a roadmap to find within your own identity, your own culture, your own circumstances, the resources to employ something like this usefully. So let me stop there, and I think we're going to have questions and conversation now. So thanks for your attention.